So Elanga's €64 million move to Newcastle has certainly raised a few eyebrows. Not only will it be the club's second most expensive signing of all time, but it's also a considerable bit of money for a player that Nottingham Forest signed for just €16 million 2 years ago. However, if there is one club in England that seems to be remarkably good at pulling off these big money moves and avoiding the well-trodden pitfalls of Premier League clubs throwing remarkable sums of money at flops, it is Newcastle. And when we take a closer look at the top 15 signings of all time, that becomes abundantly clear. This week at Transfermarkt, I took a look at exactly that. And as we can see, Elanga's move to Newcastle will place him second only to Alexander Isak's €70 million move from Real Sociedad and ahead of Sandro Tonali's €59 million move from AC Milan. To no great surprise, the Geordie club have spent some significant sums of money in recent years, but it's worth noting how many of these players have gone on to be excellent servants to Eddie Howe's team and undoubtedly worth every single penny. There are of course some players that maybe weren't worth the transfer fees paid for them. Chris Wood perhaps wasn't worth the €30 million Newcastle spent on him, and Michael Owen's ill-fated move from Real Madrid in 2005 never quite lived up to the billing. But if these two players are the only notable flops among those top 15 stars, then it really suggests that Newcastle are far better than most of their Premier League rivals when it comes to spending big money on big players. However, the really interesting thing about this is that while 10 of those 15 players were signed after the Saudi Public Investment Fund bought Newcastle, PSR rules from the Premier League have severely limited how much money Newcastle can spend, and as a result, how many players they could sign. As such, Newcastle have had to sell players to compensate for the money they spent, and surprisingly, since the start of the 22-23 season, the club's net spend in the transfer market is only the 9th highest in the Premier League. However, while these rules certainly did curtail Newcastle's spending, and Eddie Howe said in the past that it dramatically changed their approach to the transfer market, it may have actually forced the club to build a stronger and more coherent team in the long run. As we can see in the graphic, which shows which English clubs have signed the most players since the aforementioned takeover at St James's Park, Newcastle have made just 21 signings since the 2022. Remarkably, Newcastle have signed less than half the number of players that Chelsea have signed in that same period and spent less than a third of what their Stamford Bridge counterparts have thrown at new players. And despite that, there were only 3 points that separated these two clubs in the Premier League last season. One took a rather bizarre scattergun approach to the transfer market, while the other one had to be more careful and considered and prioritised quality over quantity. Of course, it's one thing to go out and scout these players and spend your big transfer fees on them, but it's another thing entirely to get the very best out of them in the most demanding league in the world. To do that, you need a head coach who can make the most of what he has to hand and has tremendous man management skills, and Newcastle obviously have that in Eddie Howe. And perhaps the most interesting thing about all this is that, much like Newcastle's overall transfer policy, it seems as though he too has benefited from the constraints put on the club by the Premier League's PSR rules. Last season, Howe only used 24 players over the course of the club's 38 league match days. Only one other club in the Premier League used fewer players, as Howe guided the club to 5th place off the back of some excellent performances from his most trusted players. This in turn has led to a number of Newcastle's key players developing and going from strength to strength at the club due to their guidance under Howe and his subsequent reliance on them. As we can see in this table, many of the club's typical starting 11 have seen their market value skyrocket under Howe since they made their debuts for the club. Whether it be young players like Lewis Miley, who came through the club's youth rank, or established players like Tonali and Isak, Howe has made each and every one of them a better player since they stepped on the pitch for Newcastle. And that's really the success behind Newcastle's transfer policy over the last 3 or 4 years. Yes, they've been limited to buying quality over quantity, but they've managed to make it work by identifying the right players and having a manager in Eddie Howe who can make the most of the players in his squad. And that's probably why Elanga is going to continue this impressive record and go on to prove to be a good signing for Newcastle.